welcome Dr. Ernie Kaninjing. I will share my screen. All right, so again, my name is Ernie Kaninjing. Our presentation today will focus on navigating the NIH grant review process. And what I intend to cover here today is really talk a little bit about the cover letter, because that would dovetail into the review process itself. And then we'll talk about waiting for the reviewers. So after writing for the reviewers, I beg your pardon, how do you write a proposal that is friendly to the reviewers? Very important point, we'll talk about the necessary administrative items, particularly for our colleagues in Africa. What are some of the administrative items that you should be thinking right now, even before you write and submit that proposal? So let's get started. So the first thing I was trying to do with this proposal is not to give you details about your scientific idea or your research proposal itself, but more after you've written the proposal, how do you navigate the process of it being reviewed, getting scored, you getting the grant award, and going to do the work that you plan to do? So let's talk a little bit about the cover letter. So this is why you want to provide some directions to the NIH, the National Institute of Health, or any of the centers, the cancer centers that will be reviewing your application. You want to tell them what are some of the expertise that the grant reviewers should have, because that will help them in terms of planning and sending your application to the right study section to be able to review with reviewers with the appropriate expertise to really understand the work that you're planning to do, and reviewers who can make some determination about the merits of your proposal. Also, you want to make sure that you include the funding opportunity announcement. So if your proposal is in response to a funding opportunity, you want to make sure that it is clear in your cover letter so that it gets assigned accordingly to the right opportunity announcement. If you have some reviewers that you think will provide a conflict in terms of reviewing your proposal, you definitely want to mention that there too, because you've taken a lot of time to work on your proposal. If you have someone else who might be competing for the same thing and could serve as a reviewer, you definitely want to flag that in your cover letter so that it could be taken into consideration in terms of assigning your proposal for review. And you have to keep in mind that only the NIH staff with a need-to-know basis will have access to this, your cover letter. So the reviewers do not get to see your cover letter, all right? So that's just some brief aspects about the cover letter, which is important because it does impact the review process. So let's talk about the NIH review process itself. And these are some of the steps that are involved during the review process. So once you submit that application, it goes to the Center for Scientific Review. They will receive that. So what they will do, they'll try to assign it to the appropriate institute or to the appropriate center based on your recommendation that you provided in the cover letter. If you did not submit a cover letter, sometimes they go by the abstract or the title or the aims or the hypothesis. So it's important, if you want your proposal to be reviewed well, I think it makes a lot of sense to indicate in the cover letter which institute or which cancer center or which of the centers it should be directed to. So the institute's scientific review officer, so the scientific review officer now becomes the sole person, the sole contact between your application and the reviewers. All right, so the scientific review officer basically manages the review of the applications, and it also manages how the application gets directed to the right institute or to the right center. So they are responsible for the scientific and the technical review of the application. Also, the scientific review officer assembles a panel of primary and secondary reviewers who can speak to the merits. So it's important that you identify the expertise that is needed to review your process, because that will help the scientific review officer to assemble a panel of people who have some of the expertise that you indicated in your cover letter will be required to make a determination about the merits of your work. And again, the primary reviewer will lead the discussion and assign a score to your application. Now, the secondary reviewer will discuss your application when it comes up, and they will also assign a score. All of the other study section participants would equally read and score your application, all right? So at the end of the day, they will have to provide an impact score for that application. So the primary reviewer will provide a written critique. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? What could be fixed? What are some of the opportunities? And then the scientific review officer will write a summary statement. A summary statement is more like a report card based on what the reviewers have taken note of after looking at your proposal. So what does the Center for Scientific Review check for when they are taking a look at your proposal? First of all, they want to see if you met all of the eligibility criteria. Also, did you submit it on time or was it late? All right. Did you use the right format? It's so critical that you don't do all the work, and then by failing to follow the format or the font size or the margins, that your proposal gets administratively dismissed. So it's very critical to make sure you follow the eligibility and all the instructions in the request for information for that grant proposal. So if you do not meet the requirements for the agency or the institute for which you requested that your proposal be directed to, that could also be some grounds for your applications to be kicked back. Again, the application can be returned without further review if you do not follow the guidelines. So there are instances where after the deadline for submitting your proposal, important information may come to surface that was not available at the time you submitted your proposal. So for example, if you have submitted patterns and determination had not come through yet, once you receive that pattern, there are ways you can indicate that it be included in the judgment of your application, all right? So there are strict restrictions on what can be added, all right? So patterns is one of them. If you have a professional promotion, that's also something that could be added post-submission. If you have a positive tenure decision, also if you have a publication, particularly if you have a manuscript get published in the area where your research is covering that is being reviewed, you could definitely have an opportunity to submit some limited items after the deadline has passed. So a deadline of 30 calendar days before the review of your proposal is when you can make that submission. And the scientific review officer determines whether or not this additional material that came in after the due date can be included with your application. The score of your application cannot change after that submission. So the core, rather, I mean, the main aspect of your application, the core aspect of your application cannot change. So your specific aims, your research methods, your strategies, all of that cannot change post-submission. So in terms of submitting additional relevant information 30 days before review, you want to make sure that you have the signing official at your institution aware of this, all right? And then you also need to follow the guidelines for the pages you're submitting. So if you're submitting a document that has a form, all right, you want to follow that template that the NIH has. That will be to your advantage to follow any format in terms of submitting documents that they already have. Also describe the material you're submitting in a note, in a brief note. Just state to your scientific review officer, just says, hey, I'm sending this additional information. This is the nature of the additional information I'm sending. So a brief note describing your attachments, and submit, just 1 or 2 sentences, don't make it long, brief to the point. And then the grant application number that you receive at the time of submission, because you want to link this additional information to that grant. Once your grant gets received, it gets processed, you get assigned a grant number. You definitely want to use that when you're submitting additional information so it gets linked together. So let's talk a little bit about the peer review process. So at least 3 peer reviewers that have been selected by the scientific review officer to examine the proposal will take a look at that and also report what they think about your proposal to the rest of the study section. Now, reviewers are selected based on their expertise. They're also selected based on their level of familiarity with your area of research. So the scientific review officer is trying to make sure that they find peer reviewers who have expertise in your area or who are very familiar with your line of research, so they can be fair and make some important determinations. And again, the scientific review officer may seek an ad hoc reviewer in the event that you're doing a research in a unique area. It could be in a new groundbreaking area where they don't have a study section expertise just yet. So she or he may find an ad hoc reviewer to sit in that study section if they have the right expertise to be able to make determination on your proposal. Now, the fate of your application really depends on how well 3 individual reviewers on the study section like your proposal. So you're basically trying to make sure that you write a proposal that will convince 3 people on that panel to say, yes, this proposal has merit. There is some scientific merit. This proposal will add to the body of knowledge. This proposal has the potential to advance scientific advancement. That's the job of your, the core of your application, is to do that, is to get 3 people on your side who are part of that peer review panel. So in terms of the review process, approximately 1 to 2 months before the study section is scheduled to meet, the reviewers will receive your grant application. And typically, each reviewer will receive maybe 4 to 7 proposals to review. That's a lot of work. I mean, think about a typical NIH proposal, it's upwards of 50, 60, 70 pages. Now they're getting 4 to 7 of them. That's a lot of material that they have to read in preparation of the study section in a month or 2 months' time. So this means you really have to write in a way that will make the job of the reviewers easy. You want to make sure that you're using the right subheadings, you're directing them to where the important information is, you're using the criteria, the scoring criteria, and really following that closely. And so that the reviewers can easily see where you're going and they can make a determination, because they have a lot of work that they have to do in preparation for the study section meeting. And then the scientific review officer will send a reminder to the reviewers within 1 week when their brief review will be done. Reviewers will review and they will score each section of your proposal. So it could be significant innovation approach. So they will score that, the environment, the investigator, do they have the right expertise to do that work? So the reviewers will score each of those sections. And then based on the preliminary scores, they will rank the proposal. So those with the best scores, the reviewers will determine which proposals they think within the top tier that should be reviewed and which in the bottom tier. So again, they do preliminary scoring in order to rank some of those proposals. As you know, there's a ton and ton of proposals that get submitted each cycle to the National Institute of Health or any of the centers therein. So they can only fund 50 to at most 60% of what they receive. So basically, it doesn't make sense for them to review everything if at the end of the day, they will only be able to fund 50%. So basically, they tend to spend the majority of their time on the top tier, the top 50% that they think makes the cut in terms of what can be funded, in terms of what proposals are very strong, very competitive, have the scientific merit to be considered for funding. So again, when writing your proposal, keep that in mind. Several proposals get received, but they can only fund the top tier, the top 50%. So they spend a majority of their time on that. 1 week before the study section meets, scientific review officers will ask the study members for a list of applications that they feel should not be reviewed. and she will prepare a combined list. Now, if any of the reviewer disagrees with that determination, then the whole study section will review that application. So you try to have some unanimity in terms of what are some of the top tier, where should we spend the bulk of our time in. So if anyone, review member, dissent, then the whole panel would actually review that application. So an official document or a report card with a short synopsis of the reviewer, this is what is called the summary statement. That is the outcome of that peer review process. They give you a summary of what your strengths were, what your weaknesses were, what could be fixed, what more information was not there that could have been helpful to them. So the summary statement is a very, very important document that you get if your application gets reviewed. They tell you for each of the primary reviewers, so be at least a panel of 3 reviewers. Reviewer number 1, you get a summary of what they thought about your proposal. Reviewer number 2, what were their main critique? What did they think was strong about your proposal? What are some of your weaknesses? So the reviewer critiques contain more information about the strengths and weaknesses. All right, also they may talk about the budget. It also contains information about the meeting roster, who was on that study section. It doesn't tell you who particularly reviewed your specific application, but who was in that study section. And it's usually available through the NIH ERA Commons account about a month after the application was discussed. So once the scientific review group have evaluated your application, the institute to which it was directed, or the center, they have an advisory council, or they may have a board that will conduct a second layer of review. So this second layer of review is actually comprised of scientists from the extramural research community and also public representatives who are approved by the US Department of Health and Human Services. So the agency staff will examine applications to look at the overall impact. They'll look at the scores that the scientific peer reviewers give to that application. They will also read the summary statements. But they also provide the advisory council with a grant funding plan. So what they'll do, they'll take a look at the mission of that institute or the mission of that center, and also see which applications are more responsive to some of the main goals, to some of the main objectives of that center. And they'll also make some recommendations to the director. Now the director makes the final funding decision, but she or he gets input again from that second layer of review that is made after the peer review has been completed. So if your application did not make the pay line, yet your application aligns with the agency's priorities and objectives, your application could be placed on a select pay list, basically saying, we don't want to dismiss these applications outright. We think there are some merits. And so if there is remaining funding at the end of the funding cycle, proposals that were put on that select pay list are reviewed and are considered for funding. And if you are fortunate to win an award, you will then be working closely with the institute or the center's program officer on the scientific and programmatic matters that a grant management officer will need to have to make sure that all the budgetary and administrative issues are addressed to the agency's satisfaction. So these are all coming now post-review. And then you can always track your application at each step of the way. So ERA Commons allows you to track the status. You go to the status bar, you can see is your application scheduled to meet, when will be the study section date, who's on that panel, and then you can see about a month after that, you go and check for your summary statement. You want to find out what was your impact score, right? So you can track all of that through the ERA Commons. Again, you track the peer review phase, you can track the scores, track if your proposal has been recommended for funding. Sometimes they could be requesting some more information, just-in-time information. They may ask you more information about your IRB, your budgets, and some of those issues. They may ask you to submit that. So you definitely want to be paying attention, very close attention to ERA comments right after the review has taken place. And you definitely want to comply, especially if you have information that are requesting just-in-time information that are requesting from you. Please make sure you're providing that information as soon as possible to your scientific review officer or to the program officer, because that could be needed to make some important determinations. So knowing how rigorous, how competitive, knowing the number of applications that gets received and how many gets funded, it is imperative that you keep that in mind when writing your proposal. So you want to write a proposal that will stand out, a proposal that will be competitive, also a proposal that is easy for your reviewers to make some determinations about the merit. So reviewers, first of all, they're overcommitted. Again, I told you a month or 2 months before they meet, they receive 4 to 7 applications, which is a lot of material to sort through. Reviewers are inherently skeptical, which means you have to provide them with information. Don't assume that they're going to understand what is not on your application. So you have to make sure your application is very clear and that you state exactly what you're trying to do and how you'll do it. So make sure your proposal is well organized, clearly written. As I mentioned before, use headings that match the evaluation criteria. So you don't want to give them reason to be searching whether or not you have this component. It should be very clear to your reviewers where the components are so they can easily read and make a determination. And then repeat important points at several places in your application. You could use underline, you could receive bold to really draw their attention to some of the key messages that you're trying to communicate. And use well-designed flow diagrams, so not just have a bunch of prose. I mean, it's easy for someone to get lost, and also it's easy for someone to lose interest if all the thing is just too many pages of words. So use some flow diagrams, use different ways, use some visuals so you can get their attention, especially if you have important information to convey. And then when you're writing a proposal that's reviewer friendly, make sure you don't exceed the page limits. You want to stay within the page limits. You want to use the right font size, usually font 11 or 12. All right, so make sure you're using that, putting information in the right section, not in the wrong section. So make it easy for them to identify that. Again, make sure you label your figures, your tables correctly. So after you've done your proposal, make sure you give yourself enough time to review. Or you can have someone else who is not in your field review it separately and give you feedback, just to make sure that you avoid some of these mistakes that are so easily fixable if you give yourself time and plan well. Make sure you provide all requested information, and make sure you run a spell check. Please don't let the reviewer spend her time or his time trying to correct your spellings. At the basic minimum, just make sure you do a lot of those basic things so that the reviewer can really spend time looking at the merits of your science and your research and what you're trying to do. I want to end with 2 very important points, particularly for our colleagues in Africa. So even before you start writing your proposal, in recent months, within the last 2 to 3 months, I have seen painfully how investigators have spent months and months, upwards of 6 months, writing proposal. And then when it comes time to submit, they are lacking some important administrative items that are required to submit documents to the NIH. So here there are 2 important things, particularly if you are a researcher from Africa. The first thing you want to find out, does your institution have a system for award management? So the system for award management, SAM, is a government-wide registry for vendors who are doing business with the US federal government. So you want to make sure you're checking with your institution to ensure that they do have that SAM number, because it is critical. Either at submission, you may not be able to submit with that now. So before you do all the work, make sure that you have a SAM registration if you plan on submitting your work to the National Institute of Health or to one of the the centers. Also, I provided you here the link where you can get the sam.gov is where you can go start that process. It does take a while. So you definitely want to start that easily because again, this is a centralized repository of information about any organization or any entity that benefits as a grantee from the National Institute of Health. And then the last item is a DUNS number, which is the Data Universal Numbering System. It's a 9-digit number that are used by businesses, and the federal government uses that 9-digit number to track more than 7 million businesses that do work with the federal government, not just here in the US, but around the world. So make sure your organization has a DUNS number. You definitely will need that DUNS number, especially in the administration if your grant gets successful. And for you to receive that award, you need to have a DUNS number. The DUNS number is a way for the federal government to keep track of how federal grant money is awarded and how it is dispersed. So check with your university signing officer. It could be the vice chancellor. It could also be your grant office. I will go to your grant office first and check to make sure that they have a DUNS number and also a SAMS number. If they don't, please request that they start that process. You don't want to do all this work and then find out regrettably at the end that your proposal cannot be funded because for administrative reasons that have to do with the DUNS number or with the SAMS number. So that in a nutshell is what I wanted to share with you. So we started by talking about the cover letter. Again, when you're navigating the NIH review process, you want to make sure your cover letter is very precise. It directs the scientific review officers to which institute you want your application directed to or what center. Make sure that there's enough synergy or alignment between your proposal and the institute or the center that you're directing it towards. Now, the scientific review officer is a very important person because she or he will review your application in terms of its scientific merits, not necessarily in terms of its scientific merits, but in terms of the administrative management of the grant, which agency to send it to, which expertise is needed to review your grant, because she or he will have to assemble a panel of reviewers to take a look at your proposal. And then there's another review in terms of the peer review level. After that's done, they provide an impact score. And then the proposal actually takes a secondary review again to determine if there is any merit with the proposal with some of the objectives of your institute. I hope this was helpful. If you forget everything, and especially if you're a researcher in Africa, please remember to check with your Office of Grant Management or with your Chancellor or Vice Chancellor's office to make sure that you have a DUNS number or have a SAMS number if you are seeking to apply for a National Institute of Health grant. Thank you so much for your time. I will be glad to address any questions that you may have. Take care. Bye-bye. Why focus on NIH grants? Well, I would definitely encourage investigators to pursue funding mechanisms that is in alignment with what their research project is or the issues that their research project aims to address. It could be grants from foundations. For example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is an example of a fund that investigators can pursue. But to answer your question, I specifically mentioned the NIH because the NIH is the largest single public funder of biomedical research in the entire world. And just to give you some perspective, in 2020, the NIH awarded over 56 different extramural projects that they funded. In terms of dollar amounts for that same fiscal year, the fiscal year 2020, they funded projects in the amount of over $30 billion. We're talking over 2,650 organizations that were supported financially in terms of their grant activities by the National Institute of Health. So they are by far the biggest player, which means there are more funding mechanisms and opportunities. And so if investigators are not looking at potentially what the NIH is requesting in terms of proposals, then they're losing out on a huge opportunity. So that's why I would recommend take a look at the NIH, because you're more likely to see an area where your research is focused on that is in alignment with some of the goals that the NIH has in terms of improving knowledge and research in the biomedical field. Can African investigators submit directly to the NIH? Yes, they can directly through, for example, Fogarty grant, all right? So they can submit directly. They can also work together collaboratively with other US-based institutions and submit applications together, again, with a US institution taking the lead and an institution in Africa being part of that grant. So how are the reviewers selected? So reviewers are selected based on their expertise, their knowledge, based on area where they've done some practice, they've published, they're well known for their expertise in that area. So the NIH and other grant funders, they're constantly looking for people with expertise in different areas, especially in the biomedical field, and they tend to put people on a pool of potential reviewers. And so when applications come in, the NIH is looking to their pool of potential reviewers, and they're trying to find who within that pool has the expertise that is required to determine the merits of this application. So can I let them know who I want as reviewers or who I don't want? The review process is supposed to be blinded, just as you would have when you're trying to publish a manuscript. But for transparency, the NIH will publish the list of potential participants in a study section. So the universe of people who could be drawn from to review your grant. You will not know who specifically reviewed your grant. But as we mentioned before, in your cover letter, if there is somebody in that study section that you believe may have a conflict of interest in reviewing your grant, you should point that out in your cover letter. Just letting the scientific review officer know she or he may have a conflict because perhaps maybe they're applying for similar mechanism. I don't know what your justification could be, but if you do have one, mention the individuals that you believe could have a conflict of interest, and you would not want them to review your application. Given the time difference in Africa, do researchers in Africa use the US time for submission? The answer is yes. It's all based on the time zone of the NIH or the grant center or the grant institute that is making the call for proposal. So for the most part, it's the US standard time, Eastern Standard Time in the US. So plan ahead of time. I would try to submit my application usually a day before the due date. Now, if you're in Africa, you have you have to follow the US time and not your African time, because it's based on the NIH Institute or the NIH Center that made out the call for proposal. Is there a bias if all the reviewers don't read my application? There is a potential for that, yes, because you want people to be able to read your proposal so they can make some judgment about the merits of your application. So, but also keep in mind that there are assigned reviewers. There are primary, there are secondary reviewers for your application, which they have to read your review, your grant. They have to read it because they have to score the grant. So there could be some bias if not everybody reads it, but just keep in mind that the primary and the secondary reviewers really have to read your review. Now, keep in mind too that when you're drafting your proposal, your specific aim should be very, very compelling. You should be able to give a general idea of your whole proposal. But if you write your specific aims very, very compelling, for the most part, it would draw the attention of the reviewers and actually cause them to want to read more and want to find more about your application. So going back to writing in a way that would attract and hold the interest of your reviewers, you do have some control over that with your specific aims page, the one page that summarizes everything. you should have enough there to draw their attention to want them to read the entire application. If my grant was not reviewed, should I still resubmit, or is it best to focus on other objectives? Now, the good thing with the NIH proposal is that if your review was not discussed, which means it did not make the top half, you still get a summary statement. And remember, the summary statement is a report card about the merits of your application. So even when your application was not discussed, you still get a summary statement that is not as detailed. And that summary statement will tell you some of the strengths, and importantly, it will tell you some of the weaknesses. So knowing what was deemed as weaknesses on your application, you can definitely use that to revise and resubmit. So I would encourage you to still read the summary statement, see what you can do to fix some of the weaknesses, address them, and try to resubmit for the next cycle. Are there guidelines on what to do with the summary statement? I can think of 3 guidelines. The first thing is, don't take it personally, all right? It's hard to dissociate yourself from your work because you've poured your blood and toil on that work for months and months and months. But just keep in mind that the reviewers are just evaluating your proposal based on the science. So keep that in mind. So the first thing, don't take it personally. They're just providing a critique of your work, not necessarily of you. The second thing is, I'll read it the first time and just keep it to cool down for a couple of days, 2-3 days, so that you can go back and read it without any emotions, all right? And what I'll do the second time around is really to highlight what are some of the pros, what are some of the strengths of this application, at least from the point of view of the reviewers, and also what were the weaknesses. So I really spend time to understand the critique in terms of the weaknesses so I can determine how best to address them. My third guideline would be to really have somebody who is experienced in that field, like a mentor or a peer who is very experienced there. Have them read your summary statement and just have them take a look at your proposal. And just to help guide you, if some of the critiques that were made, does that require a full-scale starting from scratch, or are those roadblocks and obstacles something that could be surmounted? So just get some feedback from somebody who is experienced, who knows the field, who can take a look and just give you some good constructive feedback on that summary statement in terms of what it will take to revise and to resubmit. So please provide additional comments about the impact score. So your impact score is really a reflection of what the reviewers think your research project can create an impact in your field or influence your field in a way that would advance knowledge. So your reviewers, as I mentioned before, will look at different components of your proposal. They'll look at the significance of your project. They'll look at the investigators, the key personnel that will be doing that research, how innovative, how groundbreaking, or how disruptive is it to the current way of thinking in the field. They spend a lot of time looking at your approach. How would you actually execute the ideas that you've mentioned? And then they also take a look at the work environment. Is it an environment that will enable, facilitate the work that you plan to do? Do you have the facilities? Do you have the resources? Do you have the right climate to be able to do that? So those are some key aspects that they will take a look, and they will assign a score in the study section. Now, when they are scoring your application, all right, the score will range for your impact score, will range from 1, which is very high, 1 will be exceptional, 2 will be outstanding, 3 will be excellent, 4 will be very good, 5 will be good, 6 will be satisfactory, all right? 7 will be looked at as fair, 8 will be marginal, 9 will be poor. So basically, you need a score that is low. You need a 1 or a 2 or 3. You really need a low score. So the impact score is when they combine all the scores of those of your reviewers to arrive at one score. So typically for the NIH institutes and agency, typically a score of 30 or below in terms of impact oftentimes fall within the pay line. But it does vary from institute to institute, from center to center. But that is something to check with your program officer once you get your summary statement. Say, look, my impact score is showing a score of 20 or 30. What does this rank in terms of the pay line? So that is definitely a conversation to have with your program officer after you've received your summary statement. Do you have to submit your proposal in English? The answer is yes, it has to be in English. So for those working in non-English speaking countries, you definitely want to work with somebody who can perhaps help translate this for you, which means you have to give yourself a lot of time to come down with your scientific proposal, have somebody who can help interpret that, translate that for you in English. Also, you may want to see if you can collaborate with somebody who is more fluent in English, but for the NIH, it does have to be in English. Now, can I get a SAM number for my institution as an investigator? Unfortunately, the SAM number is being issued to an institution and not to an individual investigator. So what that means is that it's the signing official from your institution, the person who is authorized to sign documents on behalf of your university or institution or institute is the person that will be required to get the SAMS number. So you definitely want to check with your Office of Grant Administrator to find out who is the signing officer who can request a SAM registration number on behalf of your institution. Again, the SAM number is for the institution, it's not for the individual, but you do need that number to be able to submit your application to the NIH. I hope this was helpful. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.